start the recording here. Okay. Today we're actually going to talk about something that I am really passionate about. Let me flip this around. I think I can here. Display settings, flip this, swap center and slide view. There you go. So we're going to talk about safety culture, and we're actually going to talk about aviation today. So these are the objectives. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the link between aviation and healthcare safety, which if you've done anything in this area before or talked to anyone in either of those fields, you might have heard of this before, but we're going to really dive into it and really talk about culture, because culture is a really huge component of what we do. The way, culture is a really hard thing to describe when it's functioning well, but it's also easy to describe when it's not functioning well, meaning that if there's a bad culture, you can probably remember the times in your own life where you've been in a situation where people were exhibiting bad attitudes. You probably can't remember the times where people were exhibiting good attitudes. That's what I mean by that. We're going to talk about something called crew resource management, which is a principle from aviation that has a lot of overlap with healthcare. And then obviously these are the other objectives. So, question, we're talking about airplanes. That's really weird. It's not something you would have necessarily thought about. Well, I wasn't the first person to think about this. There are several really, really good books on the topic. The one on the left of the screen here is called Beyond the Checklist, which is a component. So has anyone had surgery here before or know about it? Okay, I had surgery last year for the first time. The concept of checklists is a really fundamental part of what pilots do in the cockpit. They go through checklists. A lot of them are electronic now. They used to be on a clipboard. But there are ways that we don't forget things. So when I had surgery, I had rotator cuff surgery. And I was over at Physicians Medical Center in New Albany, and I went in, and the surgeon was a guy that I'd seen before. Obviously, it wasn't the first time I'd met him, but I didn't know him all that well. And if you have ever met surgeons, you know that they don't spend like hours with you. So this was a guy who does a lot of shoulders, though. And so what he did was right before the surgery, this was like his day in the OR. So there were about 12 other people around, and he just went from bed to bed, like, tell him who he is. They asked me a lot of questions. And the nurse asked me questions, but what he did was really interesting. He marked my shoulder. He said, "What shoulder are we operating on?" Left. He goes over here and marks my left shoulder. Why did he do that? Why do y'all think he did that? There you go. Yeah, so imagine they have operated in the past like that would not be something that, I guess if you get in there and it's fine, which not in my case, the right shoulder would have been like pretty bad too. But if you go in there and you're like, we're in the wrong place, like that's not good. So that is a systems approach, but that's also a culture, and it has to do with checklists. So what this book talks about is that is like a foundational thing. When you are learning about like checking prescriptions, you probably learn what you don't necessarily think at first are checklists, but you go through a checklist of, right person, right dose, right frequency, all those things that we're learning about. That's checklist. And so that is a cultural element. That is something very foundational. This book actually talks about beyond that, but we have to start there. We have to start with what the foundational elements are. The one on the right is called Soaring to Success. It's actually about the link between aviation and healthcare. That was one of the first books that I read on the topic. My backstory in aviation is about, let's say, 2016 or so. I was sick. Funny enough, when you're sick, you're kind of trapped. You can't leave your house, or you don't want to leave your house. So you usually watch television. And so I had already watched Downton Abbey about 10 times, and I didn't have anything else at that particular time I wanted to watch. That's usually my sick thing, is to watch Downton Abbey. However, I found the show called Mayday Air Crash Investigation on Nat Geo and started watching it. Turns out there are now 25 seasons of about 15 episodes per season, and every episode goes through some sort of incident or accident or crash. in aviation talks about what happened, the investigation, how they figured out what happened, and then what changed in aviation as a result of that. It is literally like the closing the loop 101 of, it's so gratifying, I guess. You just don't ever get that in life. Like, you don't ever see like something happens and then here's exactly what happened as a result of it. Think about the movie that you all watched, To Err Is Human. There weren't a lot of solutions that were noted in there. That's, inspiring because you can be part of the solution. But this show talked about the solutions. And so one of the episodes that really caught my attention was about the foundational elements of crew resource management. It was about cockpit dynamics where the pilots had, there was like a respect thing where one pilot didn't want to be challenged, and so it resulted in a crash. And I thought about, gosh, that's really, that's a lot about what healthcare is. I mean, think about the example I just gave you, surgeons. Surgeons have a kind of a reputation to be arrogant, and not to be challenged. That is a culture, right? That's something that the cultural elements, hopefully you can see that overlap pretty easily right there. That's the low-hanging fruit of the overlap. There's a ton of other things. So we are going to talk about aviation today, but not in the way that you would think. We're not going to talk about the actual planes. We're going to talk about the cultural elements that overlap. So the biggest one is what are referred to as non-technical skills. And so you might have also referred to these as soft skills. What we mean by that is technical skills would be, the example of knowing how drugs work. That's something that's technical. And why that's important is because the technical component is what differentiates you from, another member of the healthcare team. So, nurses, so in the healthcare example, physicians have a certain base of knowledge, pharmacists have a certain base of knowledge, nurses have a certain base of knowledge. So that's technical skills. Those are called hard skills. On the contrary, though, you talking to people, you having a good attitude, and by good, I mean a productive attitude, your ability to actually listen to people, is universal. So everybody on the team shares those elements. The technical skills are specific. The non-technical skills are non-specific. They are more universal. And so that's what we're really going to be focusing on today. So answering the question, how is this relevant to pharmacy? Obviously, this has come up over time. This is why I talk about it a lot, is why are we talking about this? This is unrelated. The overlap, though, is much more salient than I think it might appear at first. Aviation is very complex, and so we have known that for a while. I don't know, is anyone here a pilot or knows a pilot? Just off the, yeah. Oh yeah, you wouldn't. Okay. Well, my friend who flies us to the Georgia games, he owns Luvino, or used to own Luvino, and now he owns Biscuit Belly. He's a pharmacist. He graduated from pharmacy school with me. He used to teach here. He's a pilot, just flies a little plane. But I was interested in all this stuff before he started becoming a pilot, and I was always really nerdy about it. And so he talked to me when he was learning about it. He's like, all that stuff you're talking about, I learned about in pilot training. And I'm like, of course you did, because pilots learn about this type of stuff. But why it's important is that the systems that we're talking about, so aviation is very complex. Well, so is healthcare. I mean, the body is kind of the definition of complex. We know a lot about the human body, but actually we know very little about the human body. I always make the joke about receptors, so we're like, oh, there's a new receptor. Not new, because it's always been there. We just didn't know about it, and more importantly, probably from our perspective, develop drugs that either block it or agonize it or whatever. But the systems that are around aviation and the systems that are around healthcare are both complex. They're multifaceted. They have a lot of moving components. We've already talked about that throughout the entire quarter so far. So that actually overlaps a lot, because that technical knowledge in both fields, the technical knowledge gets the most attention. It's the kind of flashy knowledge. Like when you are talking to your friends about pharmacy, I don't know. When you are, I don't know if y'all are at the point where you talk to your friends about pharmacy or your family members, but they're probably not going to ask you about soft skills. They're going to ask you about how drugs work. They're going to ask you about the technical side of it. And I think in the same way, pilots talk about the technical skills. That's the kind of the flashy, showy side of that profession. However, all the systems that are around aviation and healthcare are as important, if not more important, than the technical components of what the individual person knows. And so that's a lot of the overlap. High risk, high cost inputs, and what are called outputs, and then what are called throughputs. Throughputs are, in a system, like how things move through a system. So another factor that's really, really critical is that the human component is a prominent part of all of it. You all probably have dealt with people in different professions, whether it was healthcare or not, who have bad attitudes, who made you feel not very good. I have dealt with people like that too. That's a human factor. Attitudes and how you approach what you do is really, really important. And then important for us in this regard when it comes to safety, what is called incident analysis, meaning when something happens, how is it viewed, how is it dealt with, and what happens as a result of it. This is the part that healthcare is not as good at. This is the part that healthcare has a long way to go about. All right. You all know there was a plane crash here recently, right? So it was a UPS MD-11, and it was a bad crash. There's a lot of stuff that happened. But what happened immediately after? Y'all remember what happened in the immediate after period? Press conferences. So who investigated it? You all? What? No. Well, they are partners, but the National Transportation Safety Board. So we have an entity in the U.S. that investigates transportation-related accidents. They immediately came to the scene, sent a team, have a really comprehensive analysis component, and all of that is public. All of the results of what happens in the incident is public, and usually there are recommendations that are made. Immediately after that, I'm not sure if you all followed up on it, the MD-11s are no longer flying. They're grounded. And we don't really know why, but the FAA issued what's called an emergency airworthiness directive, which is very uncommon. And even before that, both UPS and FedEx had already pulled their MD-11s. MD-11 is a kind of a downstream plane that was originally a DC-10, is a 3-engine plane. So my moral to that is it's public. So we will eventually get a full report from the NTSB about what happened. That doesn't happen in healthcare. It should, but it does not happen in healthcare. Incident analysis should have a non-punitive approach. It doesn't mean that there aren't consequences, because if individuals make decisions that are either unintentionally or intentionally the wrong decisions, there could and might be consequences related to that. But it isn't a fault determination. It isn't a binary. It isn't a this person or this person caused it. It's a really comprehensive approach. So medical errors, you're going to hear these stats. I actually want to go over this real briefly, but you're going to hear a lot about the stats related to medical errors throughout both what we've already talked about and then further on in the quarter, because it is really important that we know that errors are a significant cause of morbidity and mortality. This report is from back in 2016. It made a lot of news back then. The way that the assessment, so the headline is medical errors, the #3 cause of U.S. deaths. That is a little, it's complex. So what this analysis did was it looked at preventable causes of death, meaning like if you had lung cancer and you did not get treated, that's a preventable cause of death. Even though it would have killed you eventually, that is something that could be attributed to it. Medical errors of all types, and that includes errors of omission, as we talked about already, errors of commission, things that are done that shouldn't have been done, things that should have been done that were not. Those are kind of the inverse of one another. But if you add all those things together, it approaches, and it isn't close. Heart disease and cancer are still the #1 and #2 leading cause of death, but it supersedes a lot of the other ones. And I have a link there. So I wanted to present this. It's kind of like, like a big stat. it's not without controversy. And if you think about kind of an analogy, when the COVID-19 pandemic was happening, there was a lot of controversy around attributing the cause of death to be COVID because the challenge was when someone had a pre-existing condition. I've already talked about this quarter. Like when someone had, example, COPD, and they contracted COVID-19, they were more likely to die. So was it the COPD that was the thing that killed them, or was it COVID-19? COPD made them more at risk for complications. So that's kind of a mixed bag. They wouldn't have died right then necessarily without the COVID-19. So that's complicated, but that's what that article, the hyperlink there refers to. So regardless, around 250,000 Americans die from medical errors annually, and the list below that is what is considered a medical error. So if you divide that out, that's about 650 Americans dying every day from medical errors. That would be the equivalent of 2 747 jumbo jets crashing dramatically every single day of the year. Do you think that would make the news if that happened? If literally 2 huge 747s crashed every day? That would make the news. In fact, no one would fly. It just wouldn't. But everyone goes and sees healthcare. Everyone continues to participate in the healthcare system, even though it kills people. So what's really the difference there? This is a kind of an existential question of why is it that we have this thing that we participate in regularly? The last time we had this kind of discussion here, I talked about car crashes. Car crashes are a great analogy. So car crashes kill people every day. I mean, I would have normally pulled up a stat to say, like, this week in Louisville, 15 people died in car crashes. But we all hear about it regularly. We do. It's on the news. There was, a crash that killed someone on I-65. And what we think about, now, granted, I'm being kind of higher level here. What we think about, if we're not related to that person, is, oh my God, I have to take a different way to work, or I have to take a different way to school, right? We're not afraid to drive. We're not afraid to be in a car. So that's really interesting to me because the likelihood of death is much greater in a car regularly, meaning like under normal circumstances, than any other form of transportation that we would have, up into including elevators and in particular this example, planes. But there are a lot of people that are afraid of planes. So there's probably a lot of psychology involved in that, meaning like control versus not control. Drama, meaning like it seems like it'd be really bad to die in a in a plane crash. I kind of think it'd also be really bad to die in a car crash. But interestingly, one of the things, and this is kind of a side note to this, one of the things that is interesting about even car crashes is not as many people now die of car crashes or in car crashes as they used to. When I was growing up, and I'm not sure if you've had experience with this, it used to be a fairly common occurrence for people to get ejected from vehicles because seatbelts weren't as strong and weren't as required. My grandmother and my aunt were ejected from a vehicle back in the late 60s, and it was really bad. They had like lifelong injuries after that. It isn't as common anymore. People survive things. And so that's another part of the psychology. It's still really bad. People still die, but that just doesn't happen as much anymore. So I mentioned this before. This is the logo of the National Transportation Safety Board here. They're investigating the MD-11 crash. They will issue a report. But aviation culture is what we're talking about here. Every accident, incident is investigated thoroughly. You could go to the NTSB's YouTube page and pull up all the reports. They've got videos. They've got reenactments of things that happen when they piece things back together. Individuals and organizations are held accountable. So, for example, there are examples of specific incidents that happen where, let's say, an airline an airline cuts a corner in terms of not having the right safety equipment, or they don't comply with a regulation that is optional or it isn't enforced regularly. That's something that would be reported out. That's something that would be made public from an organizational standpoint. I think really importantly for this, systems are analyzed for ways to improve. What I just talked about there let's say that there was a crash where the airline's training manual didn't actually instruct the pilots. Here's a good example. This is something I just remember from watching the show. There was an incident back way long ago. Do you remember Payne Stewart, the golfer? I don't know. I'm old. So Payne Stewart was a golfer who was like on the PGA Tour, was really famous. He had a Gulfstream jet, as a lot of them do. He was that wealthy from all of his wins. He was flying to I think he was actually on vacation, whatever, but there were about 10 people in this jet. And they had it was a pressure valve. So when you are in a plane and you go up to altitude, the pressure is lower up there, and so that's why you can't breathe up really high, but they have a valve that helps regulate the pressure. That valve failed, and there was an alert that popped in the cockpit for this. So the pilots go to the checklist that the alert prompts them to. They start going down the checklist. They end up passing out from hypoxia. Everyone on the plane passes out from hypoxia because they ran out of oxygen, because you don't have as much oxygen once you're up at that altitude. So the result of it was that the plane, they stopped communicating. The plane ended up crashing in South Dakota because it just ran out of fuel. They were trying to figure out where it would end up crashing. So the challenge with that was, where did the issue come about? The pilots were doing everything they were instructed to do. The first thing that the checklist should have had on it was put your oxygen mask on, because the oxygen will drop. But that's not what the checklist had on it. The checklist had go down the list, and it was like the 5th thing was put your oxygen mask on. That is a system issue, because the training manual that they were following and the checklist that they were following told them to do something that ended up not being the right thing. So that is an example of a systems-related issue that came about because of that incident. And so after that, the checklist was modified to be where anytime there's a pressure change, the first thing on the list is put your oxygen mask on. So that's, kind of an example of that. And then number 4, changes are recommended and implemented. So I mentioned that all records are public. If you're interested in this, I don't know if anyone is, there's a great website, faa.gov/lessons_learned. It's got all of these incidents, and it has you can sort by date, you can sort by type of aircraft, you can sort by general areas where the accident started from, meaning engine issues, human factors, that type of thing. And they're used across healthcare and aviation as the foundational element for a lot of instructional materials. We don't see that in healthcare. We do not see that type of thing in healthcare. All right, I'm not the first person that came up with this idea. So this article is actually from, I believe, 2012. Does anyone recognize the name Chesley Sullenberger? Yeah? Miracle on the Hudson. All right, finally, one reference that someone gets. So the Miracle on the Hudson was this plane that was U.S. Airways flight that took off from LaGuardia Airport. They had dual engine strikes from birds, and that is unheard of. Just doesn't happen. Both engines failed. Crazy enough, engines are designed to ingest birds. They actually put things in them when they test them. So that happened to be a very uncommon occurrence, so much so that it had never happened. Airbus had no concept that could happen. There were so many birds. Basically, it was a flock of birds that this plane hit. But it lost both engines, and they ended up coming down in the Hudson River. So he is he just happened to also be an aviation safety expert person who does a lot of training materials, but he was the pilot on that plane. The third person on there, Dennis Quaid, he is an actor. So Dennis Quaid is an actor. Back in the mid-2000s, he and his wife had twins, and there was an incident at the hospital where they got an inappropriate dose of heparin, which is an anticoagulant, and they ended up having a lot of bad stuff happen as a result of that. So the last person on there, his name's John Nance. If you end up watching this show, the one I'm talking about, Mayday Air Crash Investigation, he's a guy who's he's always on that show. So all these people popped for that. So Charles Denham is all 4 of these people are really big into this area is what I'm getting at. So what they're talking about is exactly what I'm talking about, We need an NTSB for healthcare. Why don't we have that? Why don't we have an entity that goes in when there's an issue and investigates it and follows all those rules? There's a lot of reasons why. I'm asking hypothetically, but there's a lot of reasons why. It's just very obvious that the need exists for this. We see the benefit in other areas. Yeah, Brian. Yeah. So the question's about the Joint Commission, and you're right. That would be an entity that could, in theory, have a role. Couple of problems. Joint Commission is non-government, meaning that it is a private nonprofit entity that the government relies on, meaning like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, outsources some of their regulatory structure to the Joint Commission. Also, the Joint Commission is not national. The Joint Commission is large, but particularly on the West Coast, they use a different entity that isn't the Joint Commission. It's just mostly the East Coast and the Midwest that uses the Joint Commission. So that would be difficult. You'd have to have an entity that crossed over everybody to be able to have that same type of enforcement structure. And then also, the cultural elements around incidents aren't at the point, and this is what this article talks about, where there's enough buy-in from all of the stakeholders, meaning that nursing groups like physician groups, nursing groups, hospital groups, third-party groups. There are a lot of people. Think about how hard it is to get healthcare legislation passed because you have to please everyone. Everyone has to be on board with the cultural elements for this to happen. And I'm going to say this as nicely as possible. We, as a society in the U.S., do not proactively do anything. We wait till things happen, and then we make changes. And even then, the further that the time passes, the less impactful the change is, because there isn't as much what's called political will or like capital that could be spent. So that's a problem too. So it's multifactorial, but I do believe in the future that could happen in theory. What we think about now with the Joint Commission are really bad incidents. So what happened with Dennis Quaid and his twins was a sentinel event that the Joint Commission, that's where that term comes from, sentinel event is a Joint Commission term, where there's a single incident that's really dramatic that gets a lot of attention and gets investigated. But there isn't an NTSB that comes along and makes recommendations after the fact. They just report the error. They do a root cause analysis. They try to figure out, okay, this one thing happened. But what the observation was, if you're interested, this article goes into the details of why, of all the stuff I'm talking about, but also why the need is there. Because there is everything but that entity that could be the central location for these types of changes and things like that to come from. So, good question. All right, so kind of switching gears a little bit. Now we're going to talk about the cultural elements that overlap. So the first one are, this is from the FAA handbook, so the Federal Aviation Administration handbook on aeronautical knowledge. Seems like it'd be technical, right? Seems like it'd be like, oh, here's pressure, and here's what the Coriolis effect does, and all that kind of stuff. There's a whole set of chapters though on attitudes, and that's where I pulled this from. So in their training manuals that they have, there are 5 hazardous attitudes in order of alphabet: anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. So we're going to go through each one of those in detail. So anti-authority is someone who doesn't like anyone telling them what to do. I think we all know people like that, whether they're in our personal lives or in a professional setting. I might call this a type of stubbornness that goes beyond the healthy type of stubbornness. Think about the difference between skepticism and conspiracy theories. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So when skepticism, meaning if someone tells you something outlandish, you're like, I don't know about that. Let me go check into it. Conspiracy theory is like, so someone tells you something outlandish, they're like, yeah, it goes much deeper than that. That's kind of the spectrum that we're talking about here. So people that are exhibiting this attitude can be resentful of authority or authority figures only because they're authority figures, meaning that they don't have anything valuable to talk about what the person actually said. They just don't want anyone telling them what to do. That's an anti-authority attitude. So it does often stem from people who have baseline nonconformist tendencies. And I think that's being kind about it, because if you think about the cultural elements of why someone would be anti-authority, there might be a healthy component to that, meaning that there might be some, idea of like, I've been burned so many times by people telling me what to do that I don't believe anyone telling me what to do. That's a really extreme attitude to have. So one thing with this attitude that's important to differentiate or separate out is, when is it appropriate to question authority? I mentioned that before with an incident like surgeons and things like that. When is it appropriate to question authority from a both skepticism standpoint and a safety standpoint? And when is it inappropriate to continue that questioning? That is a fine line. That's something you're all going to have to figure out throughout your time. I will say one of the things from a cultural standpoint when I'm working at the pharmacy, one of the things I initially talk to the technicians about is, when you notice something, bring it to me. If you don't present that attitude and be approachable when it comes to that, sometimes the assumption is that you aren't approachable when it comes to that, and they might let things go by. I have been so grateful for people bringing things to my attention. It helps you when someone brings something to your attention. Think about, even as simple as like, hey, you've got something on your face. Has anyone gone through the whole day with something like that happening and no one said anything to them until one person said something and you're like, thank you, but nobody else said anything to me about it? That is a thing that happens. Obviously, it's very different. That's non-consequential, right? But it is something about approachability. It is something about whether people feel comfortable bringing things to your attention, period, or if they don't feel comfortable bringing things to your attention, period. So when that happens, one of the things that I try to go back and do is say, why would this have not been something that someone brought to my attention? Like, is there something, I was kind of a jerk that day. Maybe that's why. Maybe people are like, you know what? I'll let him have it. I'll let him have that thing on his face. Or I'll let him have, his fly down or whatever. Like, that just the kind of stuff. That's simple, but it also is a cultural element. And so the FAA handbook has representative quotes for each one of these attitudes. And so this one is, don't question me, just do what I say. That's anti-authority. The second one is called impulsivity. And so the representative quote here is, do it now, no need to double check. People who feel the need to do something or anything right away. Now, this is, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of something called action bias, which is where there is a tendency in certain areas, in certain situations, for people to feel like there's a need to do something. And that is not always the best thing. Sometimes it is the best thing to not do anything at all. There actually is a scientific term for it. It's called, I'll come up with it in a minute, but it's essentially watchful waiting. So the medical example of this is like if an older person has prostate cancer, like an older man has prostate cancer, typically it's so slow growing that if you have like a 90-something-year-old, they're not going to do anything about it, because by the time it became an issue, they're already not alive anymore. The life expectancy is not as long when you get to that point. But imagine in that same example, you find prostate cancer and there's an action bias, and you go through radical prostatectomy as a 95-year-old. That's going to have a higher risk of killing the person than the prostate cancer would. So that's where you get into the problems with action bias. So impulsivity as a tendency leads the person to fail to look ahead and determine the consequences of actions. The examples that I've been giving for this section aren't long-term. They're short-term. I need to do something about this. I need to do something about it no matter what it is right away. Maybe you can think about times in your life, professional or personal, where you've had that. I know I can. I think sometimes it's human nature. A lot of these attitudes are human nature, and it's what we have to fight against. But the idea that there's a balance. Some situations require type 1 thinking that we talked about with cognitive biases. Some situations require type 2 thinking. If we think that we're always going to do one or the other, we're probably wrong. And we're probably not going to be making good decisions no matter what. But figuring out what the balance of those things is a part of your professional growth. It's a part of your personal and professional growth to figure out when it's appropriate to do something and when it's appropriate to not do something. Sometimes, I'll say this from a leadership standpoint, you're going to talk about this in management. When people complain, I've got faculty members who come to me and complain. I have a tendency to want to do something about what they are talking about. Sometimes they don't want anything done. They just want to be heard. And that is universal. It's very difficult to figure that out sometimes. If you've ever been talking to someone and they, you can jump in and say, why don't you do this? And then they shut down because they don't want you to do anything about it. They want you to listen to them with what they're going through. So impulsivity is, it's one of the hazardous attitudes, but it's something that we all struggle with, I think, from time to time, if not, a lot of times. The third one is called invulnerability. And I think this one is probably more aviation than it is healthcare, but there's probably a component of that we could identify with. People who believe that accidents and incidents can occur, but they don't happen to them. I think about this in the sense of people who are good drivers. Everyone thinks they're a good driver, right? Everyone thinks they're a good driver. How can there be any bad drivers? That just doesn't make any sense. We probably have an idea that we are good drivers because of the examples. I've made it this far without an incident, right? I've made it this far. That can hurt us because if we think that we don't need the systems that are around us because we haven't had anything happen so far, we're really not valuing what the systems have done for us thus far. And so that's the constant battle that we're fighting. When people are exhibiting this attitude, they risk ignoring checklists. I don't need the checklist. I haven't used it so far, and I've been fine. How many times have you heard that? Think about people that are like, oh, I'm not going to take that immunization because I haven't needed it so far. It hasn't been an issue. Oh, okay, well, you can't argue with that because they have an invulnerability attitude, and that is almost impossible to argue with. It's what they call a counterfactual, which is I can't give them a situation that counters that because that's the attitude that they're exhibiting. What they don't understand and what people exhibiting this attitude don't understand is that accidents and incidents can happen to anybody. They can happen anytime to anyone, whether they're within your control or not. All right, the second to last one is macho. Now, macho is an interesting one because I've got Gaston up here from Beauty and the Beast. I think that's the kind of prototypical example. Someone who's always trying to prove that they're better. They one-up people. They have that kind of like machismo, if you want the longer word for it. But it's really a competition-based thing. And maybe, again, when you're hearing this, maybe you can think about it like we make different choices. If you think about people who do these racing things. I grew up in the country. There was a lot of drag strip racing and stuff like that. There are people that died. There are people that had awful things happen to them, and they just went back out and did it the next week. I don't think that that's a rational decision of I do want to live a long life. I do want to grow old. That's not what they're thinking at that time. This attitude takes over people in certain circumstances. I do think some people are more susceptible than others, and that could be an individual characteristic. And I think that goes into pride. So some people think that if it hurts their pride, think about, back in the day, people dueled. Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr wasn't the only ones, probably more famous ones. It was a really common occurrence. It was illegal. Well, okay. I'm just saying a lot of things. But that has to do with pride. It did not have to do with wanting to live a long life. It did not have anything to do with that. It had to do with pride and also culture. All right, the last one is resignation. Now, this one is the last one on this list, but I think it's the most probably salient for us as pharmacists. It is the definition is why care? I can't change anything anyway. When things are not going as intended or setbacks occur, what happens when people are exhibiting this attitude, they take their hands off, they take a step back, and they say, well, it was meant to happen anyway. So I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to do anything, even if doing something is the appropriate action. We talked about before, that isn't always the case. The challenge here is that sometimes you do need to do something about it. Meaning if your house is on fire, yes, talk about what caused it. Let's try to figure out what happened. But put the damn fire out. Sometimes you need to do something. And when resignation sets in, or when resignation is being exhibited, the person can make different decisions because they don't believe they have any impact. Now, why do I think pharmacists are especially vulnerable to this? It's because in a lot of these circumstances, we are separate from the healthcare system, meaning, well, I don't know anything about that anyway. I don't know anything about that anyway. I'm not going to do anything about that. I can't do anything about that. It's undealable with. You probably have, if you think back, you might have exhibited that yourself. I know I have, because it can be overwhelming to be a part of the system, to not have the voice for the patient or for yourself that you think others have. That can lead to this attitude, but it's something that if you realize that it's happening, you can hopefully figure out that, actually, I do have a voice. I can do something about this because I realize I'm exhibiting this attitude. All right, so what are the antidotes to the 5 hazardous attitudes? For anti-authority, again, this is more difficult sometimes than it might appear. Follow the rules. They're usually right. I struggle with this sometimes. I'm not a rule follower by design, which is ironic considering I'm talking about all this stuff, right? But what I have done as a way to deal with that is I understand the rules. I go through and I try to figure out, why does this rule exist? What are we trying to do about this? And that's my way of understanding how I can deal with the rules themselves. Impulsivity. Sometimes you have to figure out if you're thinking too fast about something or if you're just wanting to do something about it, and then figuring out if that's the best move. So that's a way to deal with that attitude. Invulnerability, it could happen to me rather than nothing happens to me or it's not going to happen to me. Macho, taking chances is foolish. I did stuff when I was younger that I shouldn't have. I think everybody does. Hopefully by the time you get older, you realize that was stupid and you survived, obviously, because you're here at that point. But taking chances in that regard is foolish. And then resignation. I'm not helpless. I can make a difference. I already talked about that one. All right, so our first knowledge check. Invulnerability can best be defined by which of the following statements? We need to fix this problem right now, no matter what. Accidents happen to other people, but not me. There is no use. I can't make a difference. And who do they think they are trying to tell me what to do? Which one? B. Very good. All right, so one of your pharmacy interns at your community pharmacy refuses to call a certain physician to get an order clarification because he claims it doesn't matter anyway, the physician won't fix it. I'm spoon-feeding this one to you. So, A, B, C, D, or E? E, very good. All right, so we've already talked about the Swiss cheese, not going to go through that. The error chain is an interesting analogy that has to do with that. So the Swiss cheese model is obviously when things align, and we go through. We talked about that week 1. The error chain, though, is kind of a different perspective on it. What it is what sequence of things, so the holes in the Swiss cheese, what were they? What things happened in a row, in a line, to perpetuate either one thing happening or the series of things that happened. They don't always look the same and they don't always feel the same because some of them could be cultural. The example in the cockpit kind of model is like, let's say there's something that happens and there's the flight engineer, back when they used to have a flight engineer, didn't feel like he could bring something to the captain, didn't feel like culturally they could bring something to the captain's attention. That's not a single thing that happened, that's a cultural thing that happened, but it's still part of the error chain. So, briefly, we're going to talk about crew resource management. So crew resource management is a management system that makes optimum use of all available resources, equipment, procedures, and people to promote safety and enhance efficiency of operations. The 3 elements that we're going to talk about here are situational awareness, effective communications, and group dynamics. The first one is situational awareness. Now, so the technical definition of this is the perception of the elements in the environment within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. That's a lot of words. Here's a good example of situational awareness. When you're driving and you see ahead of you, way ahead of you, brake lights, what does that mean? Great driver. That means there's something going on, right? I don't know what it is, but there's something going on. So what's the first thing you do? Usually subconsciously, you take your foot off the accelerator. That's usually the first step. Sometimes, depending on what it is, you'll put your foot on the brake. Now, you're not going to slam on brakes unless you're wanting to cause an accident. But What you're exhibiting there is situational awareness. If you are not paying attention, which happens, admittedly, then you look up and there's someone slammed on the brakes in front of you, and you have to slam on the brakes, and that can cause an accident. So you're exhibiting what's called low situational awareness. So you can be high in situational awareness or low in situational awareness. And from a healthcare standpoint, in aviation, they say fly the plane. Now that is really simple because the plane, even if both engines go out, one of the things from the Miracle on the Hudson is you're in a big old glider. That thing does not lose aerodynamic ability. It will glide. In healthcare, you have to look at the patient. You have to take care of the patient. You have to figure out what is it that the patient needs in that particular moment. I'm not going to go through the aviation examples of that for the sake of time. But when we in pharmacy are, one of the challenges that we face, and I deal with this constantly when I'm working, you all probably deal with it too, you're expected to be aware of everything that goes on in that pharmacy. You're responsible for it. It's not humanly possible to see everything that goes on, so that's a real big challenge. How is it that we keep this situational awareness up? One of the things I think that happens, and I mentioned this before, is that it's a mental marathon for us to be in that environment. So I go through a 6-hour, 8-hour, 12-hour shift at CVS. I finish the day like I ran a marathon. I feel so exhausted. That's the reason why, is because of this situational awareness that I have to exhibit. You have to constantly be aware of everything going on. It takes energy to do that. So what we have to figure out is how are we going to make sure that we do this? Regular breaks, keeping well rested, well fed, get sleep the night before, all that stuff, all that is great. You have to plan for it, though. You have to make sure that you're in the best headspace for it. So you can read all these separately. They're kind of logical, but essentially what this is telling us is that we have to work at it. We have to figure out what is it that works for us to help us maintain situational awareness, knowing that we're not going to be perfect about it. I go back to these examples of like, if I have a great relationship with my technicians, they're aware of stuff too, right? They're my eyes and ears when I can't be listening, if they feel comfortable bringing things to me, that is. All right, the second one is effective communications. So we had a whole thing on communications in community pharmacy, so I won't go over that in too much detail. But here is what this boils down to. I hear so many times, well, I told them, right? Well, I sent them an email. Okay, if they didn't get it, if they didn't understand it, that is on you as the communicator versus on them as the receiver. We think about it like that, then we change our perspective on it. If we just said, well, I gave them the handout. Think about patient communication when you talk about it in communications class. Well, I gave them the handout. Okay, that doesn't mean anything. If they didn't understand it, then it's just as good as you not having done that. What you didn't understand in that example is that you are a partner with the patient. You are a person who has accountability and responsibility to make sure that if they didn't understand you, you figured out a way to make a different form of communication or communicate differently so that they did understand your message. I'll go over that one. The last one, I have kind of prototypical ones on here. So these are handwritten prescriptions. We don't see them as much anymore, but those are all examples. This one's actually from CVS like earlier this year. The top one's a little easier, hopefully anyway. What does everyone think? Yeah, hydroxyzine. Yep. It says itching too. That made it a little better. What's the second one? Ophthalmic ointment. Yep. Now the rest of it, yeah, but you know, how long is all kind of like, why did you scribble it like that? Because it isn't like take as directed. Yeah, it isn't like take as directed, but that's an example. Yeah. So the last one is group dynamics. Group dynamics are something that we're actually going to spend a lot more time in spring quarter talking about. I'm going to do a module, advanced team training with you all in management. We're going to talk about this in much more detail. Group dynamics is about how individuals interact with one another in group environments and all of the eccentricities that come with that. What I mean is, when someone is a leader in a group, whether or not they, as we've said before, are approachable, feel approachable to everyone. That's a group dynamics component. It is about conflict, meaning you understand conflict exists and you don't pretend it doesn't exist because it's real, and even if you don't like it, it exists. And then how the decisions that individuals make contribute to the group, meaning like understanding that everyone has individual decisions that add up to group behavior is what this component is about. So this is what I was alluding to. I'm going to do team steps, which is a AHRQ training. Remember AHRQ from the beginning part of the quarter? We talked about Agency for Healthcare Resources and Quality. They have this whole thing called team steps, and it's team strategies and tools to enhance performance and safety. I'll go through this in significant detail in the spring. But group dynamics, I know this is like hopefully logical, but the workplace, particularly in the healthcare environment where people's lives are on the line, are not a place where winning and losing should matter. Meaning that if you have to humble yourself to admit you did something wrong that you weren't supposed to, okay, I hope you do, because my mom's health is on the line, right? Your health is on the line. I don't care that people have to humble themselves to figure out that they need to make different decisions. But these, in the example, social hierarchies do exist. When you have people who work together really closely, you all understand that right now. You all are in class with each other every day. Are there dynamics that exist? Of course there are, right? They exist. They're not fake. They're not things that are not relevant either. They impact, in your case, learning. Those dynamics could just as importantly impact the dynamics inside the pharmacy environment that you're in. When people are around each other all the time, think about your family. Your family's probably got tons of dynamics. Mine does. Probably talked about them. But those are things we have to be aware of. I think there could be a tendency to ignore it or push it away, but that's not healthy either. All right, so last question, or last two. One of your coworkers recently had a loss in her family very close to her. She came into work despite having vacation time as a way to get away from the drama. You notice throughout the day she is not focusing on her work and seems very distracted. What principle of career resource management is being violated in this example? Group dynamics, situational awareness, or effective communications? What do you all think? B, okay? So there is, I did have some people think that group dynamics was being violated there in the past. I gave that example in particular. Obviously, I wrote all of the stuff in the stem of this question to talk about the situational awareness of that technician. Distraction, had some major incident happen. That's not where I was pointing you. So when you're answering the questions, think about where the stem is pointing you. Don't rewrite the stem to put stuff in it that you want to be in it because you think that's what the answer is. All right, that is it. So thank you all very much. We will regroup next week. Next week, we're going to talk about sterile products. It's going to be really fun.